Bob and Sarah are two remarkable people. They don't like taking credit. They say we're just trying to serve, but what they've done and the energy they've put into the Parents Committee and the leadership and the hosting and the friendships they've developed, it's really remarkable. And for 2 years, what they've done has really made this place what it is. And I'm going to miss you all. And I thank you for everything you've done. I mean, before I offer some remarks, I was thinking about how the more things change, the more they stay the same. You know, we've been battling the flu on this campus, and I think the health center has been incredible in doing what they've done, and many of you have been so helpful as well. And I was looking at a letter that Horace Taft wrote almost exactly a century ago. So on March 18th, he wrote this letter to his great friend Sherman Thatcher, who, as you've heard me talk about before, was his college roommate, dear friend, started the Thatcher School in Southern California. And by the way, you know, it's in the middle of the winter. You know which campus you'd rather be at. And he wrote, my dear Sherman, this is on March 18th, okay, March 18, 1920. My dear Sherman, the winter term began badly. The influenza attacking us very soon after the beginning, and pretty soon the infirmary was chock full of influenza and tonsillitis. Then on top of it came 3 cases of diphtheria. Our nurses worked until they dropped and we could not get no more, so we closed school and took a 3-week vacation. No, that's not happening. But it shows you, by the way, it actually reminds you that it was not long after that Mack House was built. And of course, Mack House was the infirmary in those days. And it tells you something that at a school of roughly 200 students had a building with approximately 50 beds as an infirmary. It tells you how much the world has changed. So, but let me tell you what I want to talk about. I guess in a way my talk is entitled On Specialization, Range, and Surfing. And it's a talk that will begin about, in some ways, about sports, but actually is going to go to a larger area and really get to what our school mission is about. But I begin here. So last month, like about 100 million folks, I was watching the Super Bowl, and I was marveling at the newest, best quarterback in the league, Patrick Mahomes. And as everyone heard, he never actually specialized in football during his youth and in high school. It's true that in high school, in the title game in Texas, he threw for 7 touchdowns. So he clearly was a great player, but he also averaged 19 points and 8 rebounds a game for the varsity basketball team. And he was a baseball player, indeed was actually drafted by the Detroit Tigers. His father had been a pro baseball player. So Patrick Mahomes, people have pointed out, is an answer to the question, is early specialization required for success? And the answer is obvious. But the story that I found actually more interesting and that few people seem to be talking about is a story about a star on the opposing team, the San Francisco 49ers, and it was running back Raheem Mostert. Now, until a few months ago, until the playoffs, no one seemed to even know who Mostert was. In his first 3 years, he had barely touched the ball. He was cut by 5 different teams. And then in the conference finals against Green Bay, and I say this with apologies to any Green Bay fans, he ran for 220 yards and 4 touchdowns. He completely obliterated the playoff record book, and he was unstoppable. And while he wasn't the star of the Super Bowl, he still ran for 58 yards. He scored one of the 2 touchdowns. And it's not a bad 2-week run for a player who's listed most often on the career statistics page with the parenthetical phrase, practice squad. So it's a story, you would argue, of pretty remarkable stick-to-itiveness, but there's actually more to it than that. Football was never his first sport. Growing up in New Smyrna Beach, Florida, Mostert was a surfer, and he was a really good one. And that's why if you were watching that Green Bay game, you saw him at one point, after scoring one of his touchdowns, lying on the ground, pretending to paddle a surfboard. He was so good at surfing that he was actually approached by Billabong, which is the Australian-based international surf company, for professional sponsorship, and that in that world is a big deal. And like a lot of surfers, he also skateboarded. And if you know anything about surfing, you know it's really hard to do it well. You were operating in a completely dynamic environment on an unstable, multi-dimensional medium with wicked variables, and you have to draw on your experience to solve impossible problems in real time. The person who does this has to have a really serious skill set. And if you switch water for pavement and you put on a helmet, you have skateboarding. It's basically urban surfing. And I have no idea, but I think it's safe to say that Mostert spent as many hours of his youth on boards as he did playing football. And that, he says, actually shaped him as an NFL running back. When you fall off a skateboard, he says, it's like life. You get back up, you have to fight. If you want to execute an ollie or a flip, these are two tricks, it's going to take multiple times. But when you land that trick, you feel accomplished, like you've done something. And what of surfing? This is what he says. You're in a wave, and at that moment, you want to make a decision whether you want to do a trick or just ride it down. And it's the same thing with football. There are so many different angles. Now, I hear Mostert's adaptable problem-solving aptitude, his ability to apply learning across different domains, his commitment to experimentation, and think, that's someone who would thrive in this world. That's someone that I want to hire. So who knows why Green Bay wasn't better prepared to play him, but maybe it's because they didn't realize they were actually going up against a surfer. Now, the Mahomes and Mostert stories tell us something that I think a lot of common sense, plenty of people, and a considerable body of research argues, and it's this, that specializing early in a skill is not the only way to become good. In fact, specialization has real disadvantages, and sampling a range of activities has big benefits. And that's the thesis of a book entitled Range by David Epstein, just came out last year. Range, Why Generalists Triumph in a Specialized World. And it is a fascinating book. Epstein begins to work telling a story that many of us know, and you'll recognize it the minute I begin it. It's of a precociously talented boy who at age 10 months could swing a golf club, at age 2 could drive the ball down the range, at age 4 was practicing 8 hours a day, at age 8 was beating his father who had pushed him relentlessly into that one sport. You know who that is, of course. It's the Tiger Woods story. The story we might not know, he says, is about a boy who dabbled in soccer and squash and skiing and wrestling and swimming and skateboarding, who used to play tennis and ping pong and badminton over his neighbor's fence. When he was about 12, he started playing tennis. His parents barely pushed him. He didn't start training earnestly till he was a teenager. His name, Roger Federer. Now, what's amazing to me is that these stories, Federer, Mahomes, Mostert, are told in order to be revelatory. That is, to push back on that prevailing gospel of specialization. It's amazing because only a generation ago, that is not long ago, certainly in my lifetime, these were the only stories. Pretty much every athlete played multiple sports, and that's not today. Epstein writes, we're often taught that the more competitive and complicated the world gets, the more specialized we all must be in order to navigate it. Now, there are a number of reasons for this trend, but I'm going to suggest two. One could be attributed to researchers like Anders Ericsson, who is the man who gave us the phrase you've probably heard, the 10,000-hour rule, which said that elite performance only came with early specialized focus and deliberate practice. It's an idea that Malcolm Gladwell, of course, made more famous in his book Outliers. Now, that Ericsson's conclusions were drawn from a pretty narrow subset of mathematicians, chess players, and musicians didn't stop many people from misapplying, I would argue, or making the mistake of applying those results to other areas. So the research was used as justifying the idea that we had to specialize early. Otherwise, how do you in fact get those 10,000 hours in? But I think the bigger reason is more simple, and it's this. It is that specialization is big business. Epstein writes, and I quote him, the professed necessity of hyperspecialization forms a core of a vast, successful, and sometimes well-meaning marketing machine in sports and beyond. It's an industry, as I said, that did not exist just a generation ago. The men and women in these roles today, from coaching lacrosse to teaching violin, are professionals. Their livelihood depends on the market believing that early specialization is necessary. They are disincentivized, obviously, from encouraging clients to participate more widely. If that's my job, it is not in my best interest to convince some young person to do something else. And that's why if you go on phrases, go on the websites of these kind of clubs and organizations coaching, you'll find phrases like year-round and throughout the year all over the websites. To be clear, it does not make them bad people, but we shouldn't forget that the business model rests on the idea of specialization. What Epstein shows is that there's a growing body of evidence that's showing us that this approach may not have the benefits that were promised, and there may even be some serious costs. For instance, in a recent sports health journal, leading sports physician Dr. Niro Gianti writes this, for most sports, there is no evidence that intense training and specialization before puberty are necessary to achieve elite status. There's no evidence for that. Risks of early sports specialization include higher rates of injury, increased psychological stress, and quitting sports before an early age. There's a growing body of data that tells us that students are more likely, young people are more likely to quit playing a sport and any sport in direct proportion to how early they started it. The results have been duplicated in many studies. Now, conversely, he says, research around the benefits of multiple sports participation, that is, sampling from a range of activities, is compelling. Lower likelihood of injury, better overall transference of skills and ability, smarter and more creative decision-making and pattern recognition, higher levels of success and longer participation. The data is really robust. To be clear, specializers don't like the research. In an interview, Epstein noted that even when he showed those folks data, for instance, that 88% of college athletes report playing 2 or more sports, people often just don't believe him. So the more he dug into the issue, the more evidence he found that early sampling, again, think Federer, Mahone, Mostert, was critical in athletic success. It sounds a little smug, but I think a lot of folks on this campus and other educators would say, we've always known that. If I offered up a list of the top 50 athletes from Taft in my years here, and I mean professional soccer, lacrosse, golf, tennis, football, baseball, and hockey players, national and internationally ranked athletes and Olympians, Division I and III college stars in all sports, they all would have one thing in common, and that is range. But it's not a talk about sports. I hope that's interesting for you, and I really recommend the book. But I'm interested in something larger. Epstein's research also uncovered the benefits of sampling and the costs of specialization in areas far beyond sports. His conclusion is clear. People with a range in all areas prove to be far more likely to thrive in a world with many variables. And that should really interest us as a school. Here's what he argues, and he does make a critical distinction. He says this: it's true that early specialization can have benefits in narrow fields where the conditions are relatively constant. Okay? Golf and chess, for instance, where a lot of that research took place. But the real world, he says, often doesn't work the way it does with golf and chess, with relatively fixed and clear rules. The real world, and I love his adjective, he says, is wicked. He writes that with wicked domains, the rules of the game are often unclear or incomplete. There may or may not be repetitive patterns, and feedback is often delayed, inaccurate, or both. The problems are really complex, the conditions are dynamic. In other words, the real world is a lot like surfing. My guess is that a lot of you actually work in the wicked world, and you know what I mean. And when you hire, you are probably looking for people who can thrive there. And Epstein would have advice. He would say this: if you want creative and adaptive folks on your team, look for people who have range. In a world where the rules may change without notice, narrow specialists actually often struggle. He writes, when narrow specialization is combined with an unkind domain, the human tendency to rely on experience of familiar backgrounds can backfire horribly. Faced with a problem, you do what you've always done. Indeed, he writes, and this I thought was fascinating, highly credentialed experts can become so narrow-minded they actually get worse with experience even while becoming more confident. A dangerous combination. You know the idea. If you've always been a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And there's evidence for this in diverse places. There's a kind of revisionist thinking around the 2008 financial crisis and says, to what extent was that actually caused by people with such narrowly focused domains that they were unable to see larger pictures? The frequency of certain surgical procedures. He cites, for instance, I just remember this, he cites that interventionist cardiologists who are highly likely to recommend stent procedure for chest pains, there is a higher rate of success and a lower death rate in the week when they are all at the National Cardiologist Convention. It's fascinating. Response to unfamiliar situations by firefighters. There's been research in the firefighting industry profession that it is those who have the greatest range who are able to deal with variables of situations they've never seen before. Those who've sampled rather than specialized tend to be more creative, and they excel in their fields because they draw on a wide range of skills and aptitudes. Epstein notes a raft of studies that showed how technological innovators increase their creative impact by accumulating experiences in different domains compared to peers who drill deeply into one. That is, they become Swiss Army knives. That's why a study of Nobel Prize-winning and nationally recognized scientists showed that compared to their peers, they are far more likely to be trained as actors, dancers, painters, writers, and musicians. Nobel Prize-winning scientists are 22 times more likely than their peers to have had those other kind of exposures and activities. That's why British researchers found that top music students distributed their effort more evenly across 3 instruments rather than specialized in one. It's counterintuitive. If they were exposed to 3 instruments or more, they're more likely to finally excel. That's why a study of British education showed that English and Welsh students who were required to specialize in narrow programs before college made more mistakes than Scottish students who had been required to broaden their field for their first 2 years. That's why former fighter pilot and faculty member Colin Farrar notes that almost everyone he flew with, and you cannot think of a more dynamic environment than being a fighter pilot, almost everyone that he flew with had other serious interests and had great range. Athletes, computer programmers, woodworkers, builders, hunters, scuba divers, car enthusiasts. Epstein writes, the more context in which something is learned, the more the learner creates abstract models and the less they rely on any particular example. Learners become better at applying their knowledge in a situation they've never seen before, and that is the essence of creativity. So those who didn't specialize, those who look like they're driving down an 8-lane highway rather than a single-lane street, they tended to be adaptive, and they drew on diverse experiences and analogies. They applied knowledge from multiple domains. They avoided the same old rules. In a wicked world, he says, with ill-defined challenges and few rigid rules, range can be a life hack. This is how you can hack into it. Now, since the wicked world is the one we're educating your children for, the more varied their training, the more resilient and adaptive and creative they will be no matter what they do, whether it's climb mountains or conduct research, compose music, finance startups, manage an NGO, or write code. No matter what they do, the extent to which we can enforce or encourage them to experience range will have a huge impact. So that brings us to the school. Now, clearly, we are trying to prepare your sons and daughters for an unpredictable, dynamic, unstable world. If you looked at our portrait of the graduate, that is our guiding document that you'll see on the website, posted around campus. It's an articulation of our 13 desired educational outcomes. You might argue that it is a simple case for range. And that's why our practices and policies require or encourage range. We intentionally create sampling across diverse domains. It's prep for the wicked world, and we just are not going to let your children specialize. Take the afternoon program. I'll give you 3 examples for you to think about this. Afternoon program, which is roughly from 3 to 5 every day. Your children are all involved in the afternoon program in a different way. The offerings are deliberately diverse. Community service, theater, robotics, team sports, aerobics, yoga, farming, and so on. You will not find the phrases in the handbook on the afternoon program, phrases like specialized training or throughout the year. You will not find those. We require students to participate in varied activities, in particular when you're younger. We don't offer the same sport in 2 seasons. We recognize seniors who graduate with at least 6 letters at graduation. We think that participation in a range of activities aligns with our school mission, and we think it leads to more adaptive and creative graduates. The athlete or actor or violinist who wants to specialize all year is probably not going to look at Taft. They will look elsewhere. It does not mean those other programs, the Juilliards or the IMGs of the world, are better or worse than Taft. They simply have different philosophies. And by the way, you may be thinking, in what way are you seeing this in sports? I'm very interested in the data that we've had, and I've looked at it over the last 5 years. And it's clear that a lot of students, and I'm guessing many of you, actually understand or endorse that idea of range, because the number of 2-sport athletes has been steady for the past 5 years at Taft, and that's despite the national trend. Just for instance, I'll give you a couple examples from last year. Football had 22 of 33 players playing another varsity sport. Girls soccer had 15 of 22. Girls hockey had 13 of 18. Basketball had 9 of 11. Field hockey, 14 of 20. Boys squash, 7 of 10. Hockey, 13 of 22, and so on. And so we are seeing students who still want to experience the range. Second example, our basic liberal arts academic model. That is the fundamental model that guides this school. And our graduation requirements, our course offerings, they reflect a core philosophy that students should be exposed to a variety of disciplines and different ways of thinking, and with any degree of specialization only allowed at the end of the career and in a pretty limited way. Epstein sounds like a Taft teacher when he says that that sampling period is not incidental to development, it's integral. I asked John Wilson, who directs our Learning Center and is someone who's thought about teaching and learning as much as anyone on campus, I sent him a text and said, you know, you've read this book, what do you think? And he texted me back, and the first sentence was in block, bold-faced capitals. We do not know what the future holds. The world evolves so fast today that we must make sure students will be able to draw upon skills we may not know they will even need. Your child is asked, even on a daily level, to apply lessons from very different places to solve diverse kinds of problems in a dynamic environment. Jen Kennerson, who's the academic dean, says, leaning into the challenges of a varied curriculum is part of our mission to educate the whole student. So your kids are asked to lean into this every day. And I would argue that our academic requirements are simply our range philosophy codified. Third example, the work and expectations of our teachers reflects our belief that none of us are specialists. We teach in the classroom, we coach on the field, we advise in the dorm, we work with clubs, and you know that as perhaps that phrase you've heard, the triple threat model. I prefer the term general practitioners. Even if they wanted to specialize, and I've known very few teachers in my days who ever did want to, they wouldn't be allowed to. We think that diverse places of student intersection and the wisdom and perspective across multiple domains deepens the educational experience and broadens the benefits for students. Dean of Faculty Edie Traina put it this way: the work can appear seamless due to the fact that 125 adults are working in concert with each other across the entirety of the program, with the shared goal of creating optimal learning environment for our students. We want them to thrive, and that idea fuels the faculty every day. It may appear seamless, but there is a deliberate, strategic, and coherent effort of teachers working in multiple domains, trying to intersect in student lives in a way to develop them. And I'm willing to bet that if you saw a teacher today who's had a powerful influence on your son or daughter, they would say that that influence in part is because I work in so many different areas of the school. I'm a general practitioner. Epstein says in closing his book, the challenge we all face is how to maintain the benefits of the breadth, diverse experiences, interdisciplinary thinking, delayed concentration in a world that increasingly incentivizes and even demands hyper-specialization. I think you all gave an answer to that challenge when you chose Taft. So let's pull it together. An industry's emerged based on the potential benefits of early specialization. Research in recent years has shown that the promise may have been exaggerated and the costs may have been significant. On the other hand, early sampling in a range of fields is shown to lead to greater adaptability and creativity and success in an unpredictable and unstable world. And the Taft educational experience rests on the idea, the basic idea, that students being exposed to a wide range of experience across academics, arts, athletics is going to prepare them well. But let me close by making one last case against specialization, by thinking not of the benefits and costs to the individual, which I hope I've outlined and you can read about, not about the individual, but instead to the community. I would argue that the last thing our nation and the world needs is more people specialized in narrow spaces. It is hardly news to you that we live in an age where complex organizations are increasingly siloed into areas with dangerously limited focus and which have few opportunities to work together, and where communities have splintered into tribes with narrow perspectives and little ability to converse with each other. I think this is sad, and I think it's ominous. I argue that what schools should be looking for is even more range and sampling, more of anything that brings people together, creates intersection, encourages collaboration, fosters experimentation, deepens empathy, and widens creativity. We should be looking for more opportunities. The last thing we need is a world where more and more people are specializing in narrower and narrower domains. Even just yesterday, and obviously this is not a comment I was going to make until I read it yesterday. Some of you may have seen the David Brooks New York Times editorial, in which he highlighted some of the benefits and how effectively Scandinavian countries are educating, and the pull quote was, educating the whole student. Whole student. And he writes this: today, Americans often think of schooling as a transmission of specialized skill sets. If you have a thin educational system that does not help students see the webs of significance between people, does not even help students how they see, you're going to wind up with a society in which people cannot see through each other's lenses. That's an argument for range. And if we view range this way, I think it's less a way of thinking about individual achievement. It's less about whether you can arrive at elite status. Range is about the ability to meet challenges in an unpredictable and unstable and dynamic world. Range even has a fierce moral urgency to any group of people trying to exist together. And I might argue that if we view range this way, perhaps there's no gift we can give your children that is more pressing and I think more potent and more precious. And so with that spirit and with a great sense of gratitude to all of you for everything you do, I hope you have a wonderful day today. I love having you on campus. Look forward to seeing you for the rest of the day. So many thanks.